Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dan Gaspé, Mohawk from Gunnesadagi in Quebec. I've been working with First Nations all of my life, and in the last year and a half or so, working with the Assembly of First Nations as the Senior Policy Analyst in Housing and Infrastructure. And we have a crew there that deals with water and wastewater issues, housing, infrastructure, emergency management, and so I'm on the housing and infrastructure side. And I want to start by acknowledging that we're here on the Fort William First Nation traditional territory and the part of the Robinson Superior Treaty, and I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for to the organizers for inviting me. They've asked me to speak about the 10-year National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy, and to make sure that it's connected to your theme for this year's conference. I just want to, as an aside, say that I've heard about this conference for many years, and I'm very pleased to finally have been able to attend. I've heard a lot of good things about this conference, and I was able to sit in one session, part of one session this morning, and I really learned a lot, and there's some really good things happening, really challenging times for many of you, though. Acknowledge that. So the vision is building our vision and to come up with new skills to use in the communities. And this works really well with the national strategy that's been in development for a few years now, since about 2017. And this strategy is it's really intended to be a key part of leading up to a transformative change in the federal First Nations housing policy, which hasn't been changed since 1996. Just a quick overview of some of our priorities. Our priorities are set by Chiefs resolutions at all annual General Assemblies and Special Chiefs Assemblies that happen. So there's 2 of those every year, and the key resolutions are the ones dealing with the housing strategy, an action plan for homelessness that we've just are getting involved in for the first time, a resolution that asked us to work with Infrastructure Canada so that their programs are more direct and exclusive to First Nations, so First Nations don't have to go make proposals to provinces for access to many of their program funds. We want to improve federal transparency on their current funding programs that support First Nations housing. And we've also been asked to make a special effort to help the Dene Nation in the Northwest Territories because they want to be in the same situation as other First Nations across Canada in taking advantage of all the funding programs and the initiatives, and they have a very different way that their housing is funded in the North, and so I'll just touch on that a bit at the end. I'm going to speak mostly about the strategy. First of all, it's being developed working closely in partnership with the federal government, but it's being led by the First Nations. There's a national joint working group involved with representation from different regions. We have, there are several key elements that combined will inform the development of a memorandum to Cabinet, and we expect that that's going to be a very significant change in the federal housing policy, and that it's going to be largely based on transferring control of programs to the First Nations, First Nations will be building new entities to control and manage those the funding. The federal government will become the funder only, and of course the success will depend on massive new investments, additional investments to the ones that are currently made. The strategy does two things mainly. It's going to be a guide for regional and local strategies. It's fairly straightforward, and it's not too involved. Any of you who've been involved in housing for a while will note that it covers off the main bases. And it's also a key component, as I mentioned before, in informing what the new federal policy will be. The key components in our strategy basically are the whole section on First Nations skills and capacity development, the importance of governance of entities that will manage the money and deliver the programs, the various funding and financing options available, a section on related infrastructure, basically lot servicing and making sure that all the First Nations have what they need to connect to utilities and so on. The importance of keeping First Nations informed of developments and changes, and an implementation plan with short, medium, and long-term expected outcomes. Here's some of the key dates involved, and my understanding, of course, is this presentation will be made available to all of you after the conference. One of the very important things that we're doing is data analysis. Any new policy and new funding has to be based on a good set of data. What are the housing needs? What's the state of overcrowding? The state of the current housing stock in the communities, and the estimates that have been done over the years have been based on partial housing surveys, partial StatsCan census, generally speaking, inadequate information, partly because that information is with the First Nations, belongs to the First Nations, and for the first time we've been conducting over 2019 a housing survey with many questions on it. That the questions were developed by First Nations, and the survey was administered by First Nations. So the data was collected throughout 2019, and it is currently being collated and analyzed by the First Nations Information Government Centre and another First Nations run entity. And we expect that the first raw data will be available in early March, in the coming weeks. And over the coming months, there will be decisions by the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure, a national Chiefs Committee, on how that information will be released, most likely in a national report in time for the Chiefs' annual assembly in early July. Another important element to the whole process leading to a memorandum to Cabinet is the completion of an implementation plan to go along with the strategy to set out short, medium, and long-term goals over the 10 years. And the memorandum to Cabinet is likely to start to be drafted in September 2020 for presentation to Cabinet sometime in early 2021. A key element of the strategy is also the development of a national First Nations Housing Policy and Research Centre. I know that you've discussed in your plenary or in some of your workshop sessions, the need for sharing of information and best practices and so on. And it was recognized long ago that there should be some center that is accountable to the First Nations that has that as its role. And the next step for us is to get out and canvass the regions to get a little bit more precision on what that center will look like and what its role will be. Everyone is anxious to get it rolling as soon as possible. So depending on what we hear from the regions, it could be, we could see something getting started in late 2020 or in 2021. It's important to note that we're going to be, as staff, we support the chiefs and prepare them with advocacy materials that's going to be necessary. Now, once we've done all our work, we've got the strategy, the implementation plan, the results of the data gathering, all to inform a memorandum to Cabinet. But it's not that simple. You need to do your advocacy as well with the politicians, and so that'll be a big part of the work for the Assembly of First Nations come this fall. In the meantime, throughout 2020 and 21, we're going to continue to make proposals to get funding from the federal government to organize events such as the major housing conferences the AFN has organized over the last few years. The fourth one is coming up in a few weeks in Toronto, March 10th, 11th, and 12th at the Royal York. If you're not already aware of it, please look into it. We're going to have a good lineup of people sharing some of the innovations and best practices going on. And this particular conference will be 50% on housing and 50% on larger issues of infrastructure and asset management and operations and maintenance. So it's not just about housing, but other related matters. One key part of what the federal government has started doing over the last couple of years is encouraging First Nations in regions and in any context the First Nations want to propose. It might be sub-regional by, in Ontario, I know you work largely through provincial territorial organizations as well as tribal councils. So whatever format you want to propose, the federal government is open to discussing the transfer of housing control. And for now, we've come up with the term housing infrastructure service transformation. It's not the best. It sounds very bureaucratic, but hey, there you go. And so they tell us they welcome all discussions with any First Nation in all regions at some kind of collective level, I believe. I'm not 100% sure of that. We'd have to ask the federal government. Not sure if it includes individual First Nations. So that's kind of it in a nutshell on the strategy, but I just wanted to point out that we're also working on homelessness. We've been asked to make sure that the development of an national action plan on homelessness, which we've been asked to do, is linked to the housing strategy, the national housing strategy, which I just described. And it's, if anybody has been involved in homelessness issues, yes, there's a housing component definitely, but it's a lot broader than housing. And so there's kind of a very brief outline of the work that we're just starting, which is to gather information and across the country about how First Nations are involved, if they're involved in homelessness, get a better sense of all the urban Indigenous groups that, and there are many of them who've been receiving funding for some years from different sources, to to provide services to First Nations and other Indigenous people who are homeless, and pull that all together in some kind of recommendations to the Chiefs at the coming annual assembly. The other resolution I referred to earlier about infrastructure, the Chiefs recognize that Infrastructure Canada has a very large budget, something in the order of $180 billion that it doles out to different regions and provinces and territories and so on. And it was recognized that a lot of those programs are force the First Nations to go and compete with provinces or compete with the private sector to access the funding. And although one of the key mechanisms is our 10-year bilateral agreements with provinces and the territories, and even though those bilateral agreements require the provinces to provide some funding to the First Nations, we know that in many cases the provincial governments are not exactly friendly to the First Nations, and many First Nations resent the fact that they have to go and either seek money from them or compete with others when they should be programs exclusive for them. So that we're taking steps working with Infrastructure Canada to see if we can get that changed, and we're still in the early going. Infrastructure Canada has been accessible, but I wouldn't say we've made any big breakthroughs yet. The resolution on transparency, which was passed recently, was to empower us to put some pressure on the federal government, Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation in particular, to be able more transparent with the regions and with the AFN on the use of their program dollars and their programs. It came to light, especially through a couple of regions that were concerned that they found out late or in the middle of the fiscal year that RAP renovation program dollars were reduced from the previous year without prior knowledge. So we think a better job can be done, and so far Indigenous Services Canada and CMHC have responded very well, and that we're looking at ways to get that information circulated about the funding and try to develop a mechanism where if there are going to be program changes, that we know about them from the outset, not 6 months after they've been started, or any initiative, any new initiative for that matter. And finally, the Dene Nation, of course, they're in a different situation from First Nations south of 60. Their housing is basically run by the government of the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. They have if you think you have very few supports in housing, they have 10 times less. And so they're, on one hand, they are eligible for discussions with Indigenous Services Canada on transfer of control, but it isn't Indigenous Services Canada that has the control in the Northwest Territories. So it's providing quite a bit of a challenge, but we're trying to work that through. Finally, in my comments, I just wanted to note that the report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that came out last year, I highlighted one of its sections, basically to paraphrase it, that one of the most contributing factors to missing and murdered Indigenous women, including First Nations women, is the inadequacy of the housing. And if you look at their report, I did a number count how often the various documents referred to housing, and it was 370 times roughly, more so than health and education and economic development and so on. Miigwech, Nyaogoa. That's my presentation. I'll be available after to answer questions.
Does anyone mind if I do my presentation sitting down? That microphone's a little low to the stand, and I'm a little tall, so I noticed everyone's been hunched over on the stand. Ani, Berg Dajnikaj, Wanapate Donjiba. My name is Berg Dokis. I'm a member of Wanapate First Nation, which is where I was a counselor, but also I have family ties to Dokis First Nation, Nipissing First Nation, and Wakwamacong. On my mom's side, Wanapate is where our traditional land base is. I'm an employee of Chiefs of Ontario. Currently, I'm the Director of Policy and Provincial Affairs. And housing is a little bit outside of the role or the job description of what I'm doing, but I've been carrying this file now for about a year and a half at Chiefs of Ontario, and trying to give it legs and move forward. And Dan, and for those of you that were here for the Indigenous Services Canada and CMHC presentation before this, kind of helped set the stage for what I'm going to share. But before I begin, is anyone not from Ontario in here? From one of the the last session there was quite a few people. So for those of you who don't know, Chiefs of Ontario is like our provincial regional organization that provides support to the First Nations here in Ontario. So it's very similar to the Assembly of BC or some of the other provincial territorial organizations. I wanted to share this with you guys because this was actually just passed by the Chiefs in Assembly here in Ontario last week. We had our February SCA, our Special Chiefs Assembly, which normally takes place in November, but just due to some other activities that we have going on here in Ontario, we moved it to this past February. And since last June, starting at our June AOCC, which is the All Ontario Chiefs Conference, which is our big annual gathering, we got feedback from our chiefs, and the intent was that we wanted to get a sense of modernizing sort of the organization to reflect what we do now in terms of supporting our communities. So our sacred purpose statement or our mission statement is that Chiefs of Ontario supports all First Nations in Ontario as they assert their sovereignty, jurisdiction, and their chosen expression of nationhood. Our new vision statement is First Nations in Ontario are united towards self-sufficiency. I forgot I got two things here. Sorry about that. Dan's going to have to keep reminding me. So First Nations in Ontario are united towards self-sufficiency and vibrancy while never forgetting who we are. This unity is facilitated through the Chiefs of Ontario. Our four key mandates is to advance the rights and interests of First Nations Ontario, restore and enhance the relationship between First Nations, the Crown, and the people of Canada, work in coalition with other organizations to support the rights and interests of First Nations in Ontario, and work to provide research and analysis on federal and provincial budgets, policies, and legislation. That last piece is kind of what's relevant in terms of relevance in what we're doing in terms of housing. Our current mandates on housing within the Chiefs of Ontario, there's two that were passed by the Chiefs of Ontario, and then of course there was one of the AFN resolutions in which Dan referenced. So the first one that sort of impacts the work that we're currently doing came from May 2017 at a Special Chiefs Assembly. And I actually think that this was during an AFN assembly. And this resolution called for the Ontario Housing Strategy to be developed. It also called on the establishment of a Chiefs Committee on Housing. We don't necessarily always have an active Chiefs Committee on Housing at the Chiefs of Ontario, but obviously given some of the landscape that's been taking place recently, the Chiefs decided that we needed to get this Chiefs Committee up and running. In July 2017, again, this is one of the resolutions that Dan references, that the development of a national housing strategy was that mandate was given to the Assembly of First Nations, and as well they were asked to develop a terms of reference for their Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. So I'm going to kind of come circle back to this last mandate because I just got it last week. On February 2020, which is last week in Ottawa, the Chiefs directed Chiefs of Ontario to source funds to commence engagement with communities on what care and control of housing can look like for Ontario. So my presentation is going to kind of lead up to where we're at right now in terms of having this new mandate. So as Dan's kind of mentioned, is that this fall we're going to be working on a memo to cabinet, and this is actually an effort that's been ongoing since about 2017, and there's just ongoing, and Danny and I can both agree that there's things that just kind of factor into working and coordinating nationally in order for us to get a memo to cabinet, and one of those pieces was that data collection aspect that Dan references, that we need the evidence to take into that memo to cabinet. And as well as we're trying to coordinate with all the other regions across Canada. So, and we also had an election last fall, which impacted our ability to get a memo to cabinet done. In early 2018, the Chiefs of Ontario, we actually did have an engagement strategy ready to go. But at that time, we were sort of all working in piecemeal in Ontario. I think it was Mishkegawak was trying to get their own activities going. Anishinaabe-Aski Nation was trying to get their own work going. The Union of Ontario Indians, or the Anishinaabe Nation, had some of their work moving along. And then some of the independents or the other PTOs were kind of struggling as to what they were going to do. And this sort of asked us to start coordinating things on a provincial level. And that was basically trying to get an overall Ontario plan moving along. In parallel to this, COO has been participating in the National Housing Strategy Joint Working Group along with staff from the OFN TSC. And the member was actually Grace Martineau, who's here today, was working at OFN TSC, and she's been sitting on that committee for quite some time, but I was asked to join to kind of help coordinate from the perspective of our leadership. I think it was last fall or the fall of 2018 is when it was decided that we're going to commence this data collection exercise, which would help drive and lead up to this memo to cabinet process, but also inform our chiefs here in Ontario on the steps that we need to take moving forward. So OFNTSC began the data collection here in Ontario, and to Grace's credit and to those that she worked with at the Tribal Council, by spring of 2019, we actually reached our threshold of having enough data to do our analysis, and by that I mean projecting the numbers that we don't have for some of the communities that weren't able to participate for varying reasons. So we ended up having 109 communities out of 135 participate in this, which was 81% participation rate, and I think the national average was about 60, 65.
Maybe just under 60.
Yeah, so we were well ahead, and we've obviously we did a great job here in Ontario collecting that information, and I credit the tribal councils, the housing managers across Ontario, and of course Grace for getting that work done. So during this time, we were obviously, Grace and I were participating in the joint working groups at the AFN level. One of the challenges that's been kind of going on is that we have had to wait for other regions to get their data collected, and for varying reasons, other regions are having challenges, whether it's capacity at the community level or being organized at a provincial level to get their data collection going. But as Dan's mentioned, that data is now with the First Nations Information Governance Center, our FNIGC. And we're going to have that data soon, so that's going to help drive that memo to cabinet that's taking place in the fall. But it's also going to help drive some of the discussions that we're going to have here in Ontario, and I'll share more about that in a moment. As for those of you who were for the last session, Indigenous Services Canada mentioned that we had some meetings here taking place this past 6 months here in Ontario. So one of those things was that in 2019, the Chiefs here in Ontario decided that they're going to continue working as part of the AFN process and support the National Housing Strategy and look at how we're going to implement that here in Ontario. So one of the meetings that we had was on August 27th, 2019 at the ISK offices, and the Chiefs at the time called it the Housing Summit. Oh my God, sorry guys. I'm sure I'm doing a great job telling the story, so I wish this was hooked up to the thing so it's just easier. So this was a housing summit, and it was actually on the anniversary of when the Chiefs first started examining how they're going to approach housing here in Ontario. And updates and progress that was shared with leadership during this meeting to seek their feedback and recommendations. 4 key things came out of this meeting. One is that we were going to host a meeting on October 7th, which was connected at the same time that we were hosting some strategy sessions here in Ontario. And this would be an opportunity for us to bring in all leadership. The Housing Summit was primarily comprised of our Chiefs Committee on Housing. The second thing is that leadership will explore a process to extract Ontario's data from the AFN process, and that just means that for us to move forward here in Ontario is that they want to identify as a collective, what does Ontario need to advocate for on behalf of our leadership have to advocate before on behalf of our communities here in Ontario to ensure that Ontario has enough money coming in to support all of the communities here in Ontario. And again, that wasn't just on new builds, that was on existing renovations that needed to be done. And I believe there was also some questions related to infrastructure on that. And I see Grace is nodding her head, so I am correct on that. Also, they wanted to look at some of the technical expertise that we were bringing to the file, and they want to get our technical committee up and running again. And the other thing that we were directed to do is draft an options paper that could be presented on October 7th. I remembered that time. So on October 7th, we brought as much of the leadership as we could here, and we invited all the chiefs here in Ontario to have a discussion about where the housing file was at. So there was an update provided, including the summary of the August 27th meeting. There was an update provided by Grace Martineau, or the FNHC, on where the data collection was at. Chief Shining Turtle did a bit of a discussion, and Chief Shining Turtle is from Whitefish River First Nation down by Espanola. And he's our representative on the National Chiefs Committee at the AFN. And he's been around for, it's got to be like 20 or 30 years. And so he laid out the whole background on what's happened in housing pretty much for all First Nations here in Canada. And he talked about some of the challenges that we've had with the existing types of programming. And what he has is this idea that here in Ontario, we need to be open and think about all of the possibilities in front of us. His idealism is something around the idea of having a centralized fund come into Ontario. How we all access that is something that we need to have discussions around. But his goal is to he really believes in the concept of taking over the care and control of housing here in Ontario. So he gave a long discussion with the leadership and sort of set the tone for the rest of the day. We then had a presentation on the options paper. And I was a little bit reluctant to get too much, and I was going to put the slides up related to what these options look like in detail. But out of these October 7th meetings, one of the things that we're doing is taking a better look at those options. They were very preliminary, but one of the approaches was having a centralized approach, which is basically having one sort of, I don't like using the term housing authority, but that's kind of what people kind of understand when I say housing authority, is that there be a centralized housing authority for all of Ontario, and all First Nations have to access that singular body in order to get their funds. There's a little bit more to it than that, but just for the simplicity of this discussion, I'll leave it at that. The other one was a hybrid approach, which is where we would have a centralized body that would collectively advocate to get the funds here in Ontario, and from there the distribution could be varied. It could be by tribal council, it could be by provincial territorial organization, and so I'll also leave that at that, because we are looking at sort of revising that model and making sure that it's something that's understandable. And we also had a group discussion related to that options. I'll be honest with you, on October 7th, I think we kind of blindsided people with not just the concept of care and control, but Grace did a great presentation on these two potential approaches that we could look at for Ontario, and I think when we asked for feedback, people just kind of stared at us like we were speaking some foreign language, and it was just something that I think it just needs some time to settle in. And so we've been writing some briefing notes. I've obviously did an update to our chiefs last week and sort of let them know that we need to have more discussions about what is Ontario's approach going to look like going forward. So some of the recent activities that we've been undertaking at the Chiefs of Ontario is, this is something that, like I said, is my title is Director of Policy and Provincial Affairs. I took on this role last fall. We are looking for someone at Chiefs of Ontario to help us with this work. I think we're willing to be a little bit more flexible. We were hoping to bring someone in as a hire, but recent discussions with some of the leadership said maybe it's time for us to start looking at someone who's maybe external to the organization that we can contract. And one of the things that while we are looking for someone obviously who has some knowledge about housing, the big thing is we need someone who understands how to engage, and someone who understands the different regions that we have here in Ontario and how to reach out to them and how to have these types of discussions. So it isn't just about housing policy, but it's really this discussions about housing governance and getting our leadership to come together and have some tough conversations. So the other thing I mentioned earlier is that we are going to get the technical team up and running. They are going to take the paper that was developed by Grace and Jeff Laux from it's Hiawatha First Nation, provided some insight, and Jeff has been working and providing support to BC as they've been working on their model for the taking over care and control. So this technical team is going to take a look at that paper, but also they're going to provide recommendations on how the engagement here in Ontario should work. We probably are going to look at a regional-based engagement where we're going to go up to probably either Kenora or Dryden, obviously here to Thunder Bay, possibly somewhere along the 17 corridor, which is like Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, North Bay. And for the south, we'll be probably looking at maybe having a large gathering at Casino Rama. And again, this is about sharing the same information I'm basically sharing with you guys, but in a little bit more detail, and to trying to get some feedback as to what care and control should look like here in Ontario. I don't think that this is going to be a simple process, and there's probably going to be a lot of follow-up discussions with our leadership, but our goal is that within a year from now, is that we have a model that we can take back to Indigenous Services Canada and say, this is how care and control is going to be transferred here in Ontario. I can't tell you how that's going to look because I have no idea. I don't have any prescribed notion of how it should look. That's not a decision for me to make. That's a collective discussion that we need to have here in Ontario. So once the options paper is ready, engagement with the communities, like I think I just basically said all that. So that's basically my presentation. I think Jan and I are definitely open to taking on a number of different questions about all of this work, and so I'll leave it at that. Sure. I think there's a microphone around here for... Sure, yeah.
I just had a quick question about housing authorities. It seems like the word term and words are pretty powerful. So what do you see, how would you describe the housing authority intent or object? Like what do you want it to be?
So for those who couldn't hear, the question was, is because I said I'm not really crazy about the language housing authorities, but the idealism is like, or the question was basically what is meant by when I'm referencing something called a housing authority. I'm going to use the centralized model because I think it's just easier to explain, but it's some people would call this devolution, and we're trying to stay away from that, which is basically we're just handing off the programs and services that ISK currently delivers into a new institution that's governed by either a collective of First Nation communities or some kind of governing body. But the idea is that, you know, obviously we're not going to take the programs and services that are not working and just put them in a new body because we're just going to get mad at each other and fight over the funds. And so the idea is to create a new institution. I don't even like saying the word institution, but a new body that would be the governing, like the collective of the First Nations will and intent on how to manage those funds. I would imagine in the longer term that may even include looking at things like infrastructure and other areas that we have to manage in terms of our community development, maybe things like emergency management, fire services, but initially this body was going to take a look at how to manage housing in Ontario. So it's, maybe Dan can add on that.
Just to add to that, if you look at the national strategy that the Chiefs approved in December 2018 by resolution, it has a section in there that indicates that these entities, is the word I use for now, because we don't know what they're going to be. These organizations, entities will be not under direct political control. That was important, that they be at least arm's length from the political process, and that they be accountable to the First Nations. So accountability, how do you make sure they're accountable? The BC Housing and Infrastructure Council is one of the first ones out of the gate discussing this with Canada. They're developing their own options, and I think all regions will benefit from the others that are ahead of them to look at what's been working and not working and choose something for their own region.
Hi, my name is Leslie Archibald. I am an authority. I'm Kruger Housing Authority, and I'm a standalone nonprofit organization, and I look after the housing for a town called Kruger, and I have 1,000 people. What it allows me to do, I actually report to two types of people. I'm not a government employee. I am directed by a board of directors, which is all local individuals that is appointed to positions, and I take direction from them. I also take direction from the government because they give me money, and I mix the two together, and that's sort of how it works. I actually take my own issues of my local area, and I'm giving, mold is my thing. I'm into mold right now. So I say I need to do mold and remediation, and I need new windows, and I have to update my electrical. So what I do is we call it an M&I, and all that means is it's government funded, and I put in a report of what I need to do and how much it's going to cost me, and I get my board to sign off on it, and then I send it out, and then it comes back, and I don't lose. So it works.
Yeah, that's simply put, I think that's really what we're trying to do, but on a much larger scale is identify the financial need, set up a governing body, and as Dan said, it would be not connected directly to the political bodies out there, but rather, I would imagine that when we envision this thing is that the board is going to be comprised of the proper technical people, and of course it would be supported by the chiefs and assembly when they go out and advocate for the funds that are needed for that organization.
This one's for Dan. Dan, you were talking about the Dene and the Northwest Territories. Is this the same for First Nations in Yukon and Nunavut in regards to the issues that the Dene are having?
The First Nations in Yukon, I'm not as aware of the details, but I know that some of the First Nations in the Yukon are involved in self-government discussions with Canada, and housing is included in that. The others who are not involved in those discussions, my understanding is that they are eligible, just like any First Nation is, to have those discussions with Canada about transfer of control. But they have not reached out to us to get into any detail about their plans, so I can't enlighten you any further than that.
Yeah, and the second question I have, thanks for that. The second question, I was wondering about your 81% response for your survey. Some days I wonder why others don't respond. I work with Natural Resources Canada. I see proposals coming in. I help to evaluate and stuff like that. But I realize at the same time, a lot of First Nations are suffering from burnout from government asking for proposals. It's the same people having to refill out an application every time there's a proposal for every different department, for every different project and scheme that the government has in place. And that puts a very heavy load on the council and everyone involved with that process. And I've addressed that just previously at the last meeting with CMHC to see they're going digital, and maybe there's an option there that there could be more transfer of this kind of data within government to make more of a horizontal approach to it. Would you say that 19%, of that 19%, some of that problem of applying is an issue?
Well, first of all, the 19% applies in Ontario. If you go Canada-wide, it's more like 40%. But there's wide variation in each region. I'd say that there are many reasons. One of them that you highlighted, burnout, what do they call it, consultation fatigue. There's very many terms being used that when the Trudeau government started a different approach than its predecessor, and there was a lot of requests for talks and input into a whole range of areas. And, as you know, some First Nations don't have all the staff you need to respond to these things in a easy way. And so we have to be conscious of that. And this is the first time that a survey on housing has been done across the country where every First Nation has the same set of questions over the same period of time. And I think it's to be expected that on a first go-around, there are going to be problems, difficulties, challenges that we will learn and improve on the second go-around. Because gathering data is an ongoing thing. You don't just do it once. It can be 3 years, 5 years. It's a constant thing. So this is our first one, and we're learning from it. And some of the other problems could be political. It could be just the fact that the communities don't have a lot of resources at their disposal. So, yeah.